This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning, and we take a look at the political pieces we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 7th day of October 2020, and I am DM.
I am Tuam.
And I am JM. In case you missed the headlines this morning, here they are. In the Daily Nation, the holiday is over. In the Standard, what new school calendar means. And in the Star, 10-day Xmas break for teachers and learners. Let's begin though with the more pressing events of the day.
Absolutely.
Following from the very turbulent weekend that we had politically.
Yes. Two things have happened today from the seat of state and from the seat of government. The first is President Uhuru Kenyatta has announced a national prayer weekend scheduled from this Friday to Sunday. And the second thing is the National Security Advisory Council, NSAC, chaired by Joseph Kenya, has announced some measures that government will undertake in enforcing the law, particularly the Public Order Act. And of specific preference that I chose from that statement is the order that any person wanting to address a public meeting will have to seek permission 3 days prior from the day of that meeting, and I think that announcement was made in cognizance or with regard to Deputy President William RUTO. I don't know how his meetings at Karen will start. I don't know whether he'll go to a police station next to Karen.
To make an application for people
to make an application to the OCS for him to have a meeting. I don't know how that will pan out.
Guys, isn't this curtailing our constitutional freedom to congregate?
Absolutely.
And to associate?
And I think that's okay.
Absolutely.
Africans need to be finured just a bit for them to follow to follow the line. You see, you cannot have a breakdown of law like we had in Moranga. All right, people going and stabbing each other in the open, and police are unable to do anything, all because of politics. I think we've gotten to a point where some freedoms, if need be, have to be curtailed, if at all we need to get our act in order.
Yeah. Did he give a timeline?
The statement was actually directed at politicians, and another word for politicians is manipulators of men. That's what they really are, to be frank. These are not even leaders.
At least women are exempt.
And I mean men in the general sense, because women sometimes could even be far worse than men. More gangster, we've heard from political circles. But the point here is that the politicians this weekend behaved completely recklessly. And these are politicians on the Kieleweke side, on the Tanga side. Both of them were behaving totally recklessly. Totally out of order, involving ordinary Kenyans and citizens in their own battles. It's totally unacceptable. Hence why NSAC had to come out and make this statement and really just remind these these manipulators of men, rather, that their boundaries that are not supposed to be crossed, because now we're getting into a slippery slope sort of situation.
I do think though that because it is specifically a suspension of freedoms, then they should have put a timeline on it so that it doesn't continue in perpetuity. But I want to say that I do laud the president's announcement that we will have a 4 days of national prayer culminating in a meeting or in a prayer breakfast on Saturday. I think well, the way where we find ourselves politically right now does require a lot of prayer, does require a lot of contemplation and a lot of thinking, because as I had mentioned before, it is a sign of things to come. And so we must do everything that we can to forestall it.
No, DM, you're so right. He comes into the country and he finds a mess. And the person in charge is the person leading the charge against, what happened in Moranga. Now he comes back and he says, look, we need to put country in order and stop this madness. He's a bigger man.
And you know who else should do this? Who else should step in? It's the military at the end of the day. And if you noticed yesterday, Uhuru spent his whole day away from the shenanigans of civilians, away from the shenanigans of cheap, petty politics of politicians. And it goes back to what I've kept saying from one of the final thought books we said, where the author noted that in the era that we're living in, we're increasingly experiencing the democratic fatigue syndrome.
Yes.
That citizens are increasingly getting frustrated and getting to the end of the line.
Absolutely.
With politicians who don't deliver on their word.
Yeah.
Politicians who are, get carried away by the day-to-day politics.
Yeah.
And can't focus on the development.
Absolutely.
And who has done a really good job at filling in that void and that gap.
It's the military.
It's the military in Nairobi through General Badi.
Yes.
And maybe that is a model that we should consider scaling up.
To M&J, if politicians are manipulators of men, what is the military?
Fantastic question. Let me answer
Take
this
that
one.
one. Take that one.
The military are the leaders of tomorrow, and I want to have a distinction. So there's a difference between politicians and leaders. Politicians think about the next election. Leaders think about the next generation.
And we have one of the most professional militaries.
You've answered it sufficiently. You just wanted it to be more poetic.
All right. Anyway, so those are the events of the day. And I think we can very quickly just discuss the headlines of the day. Not particularly inspiring. Education, a very dull topic.
But an important one.
But an important one, yes. So the Daily Nation, the holiday is over, and what we're told is that schools will reopen next week for learners in 3 classes, which are crucial to transitioning to the next education levels. Yeah. This is Standard 4, Standard 8, and Form 4 learners. So they go back to school Monday. And Magoha has opted for this phased reopening so that there's not too much disruption and we don't lose the entire year. And that's just about it.
Yes.
On the 23rd of December is when they will close for 10 days, reopening sometime in January.
Yeah. The Standard gives another angle, which is what the new school calendar means, particularly to parents, because it's quite sudden. A lot of parents find themselves in the situation where they do not have the school fees, or they do not have the period or the time to raise that school fees, seeing as the children are going to school sooner than they thought they would. Absolutely. And of course, they're also talking about the COVID, the pandemic background. A lot of people have lost their jobs or have had their wages or salaries adjusted downwards if they still have their jobs. So it's also that tough time that they are facing. I think a lot of people would find this announcement by Magoha to be quite, not only sudden, but arbitrary.
Yes. Do you think inconsiderate?
Do you think what?
Do you think inconsiderate?
Inconsiderate.
Perhaps to the extent of not considering the parents in the time of the pandemic. And as Magoha also gives a directive for the temporary suspension of school fees. But then that also becomes unfair to the schools because they do need that school fees to run the school. So it's so it's a conundrum.
I think we toss the Standard and the Star. And perhaps we give the winning cartoon to the Daily Nation. What do you
The winning headline is the holiday is over.
Yes, absolutely. The holiday is over. It's and on to the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. We've got a 3-part criteria that we use to assess them.
Yes.
Are they humorous or dry, satirical or pessimistic, and effective or just plain lazy? As usual, Gado has not submitted a cartoon. I think he does that once or twice a week. Don't know why. But tell us about what's in the Daily Nation.
Ndula, and you have caricature of President Uhuru Kenyatta returning from Paris, and the suitcase is "I love Paris," and he's entered a room full of absolute shenanigans. And caricature there is William Ruto in his wheelbarrow, and pulling his shirt is Tuju and Murade out there, and the BBI report is flying in the air, and right next to Tuju is Ali Sohome and Moses Kuria. It's absolute pandemonium.
Pandemonium.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, NMS and KDF had rehabilitated 83
cars,
vehicles which had been ground, and they're rehabilitating more to give Nairobi better services.
Do you know at what cost?
At what cost?
22 million shillings.
22 million shillings only.
Yeah.
My word.
Tells you the stuff that can happen in this country if you got rid of this rot and
this rot we're seeing in this cartoon
we can achieve so much more.
I think the Star is in the same vein. Uhuru is also returning home from France only to find Murade, Tuju and Ruto fighting inside the presumably it's the JP headquarters. And the cartoon depicts the state the party is in following the president's departure to France. and RUTO's quote-unquote raid of the building last week. I think both cartoons are really depicting the chaos that the president came back to.
Absolutely.
But I particularly like Daily Nations because Ndula's, because as you described it to him, it's a pandemonium and chaos, and everything fell apart. In the few days, there's two things. In fact, the other one hasn't been covered here, which is the chaos that happened in Murang'a, and of course that one is even more grave, serious, and worrying.
Absolutely. So whom do we award the winning card?
I would say Ndula.
Daily Nation.
Ndula.
Visually, he has represented
that was very humorous.
The state of things.
That's a good one. And now, on to our final thought. But before we get there, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And so, what is our final thought?
And now our final thought, it is inspired by a book entitled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder.
Yes. Snyder wrote this book in 2017, and it's about how to recognize and identify the warning signs of a tyrannical leader or of tyranny in general. And it explains to people, to communities, and even to nations how or what they can do to resist the rise of dangerous political leaders. So one thing he urges readers to do is to be on the lookout for the different ways that tyrannical leaders can distort the truth. And he writes that we are in the post-truth era, where facts are dismissed in favor of alternative ones. And he says that there are 4 stages in the process of the truth getting either twisted or completely diminished. And the first stage is open hostility to verifiable truth and reality. So the example that he gives all through these stages is that of Trump, particularly in his campaign in 2016. And he says when it comes to open hostility to verifiable truth, he gives the example of when Trump was on the campaign trail, a study was undertaken and it found that 78% of the declarations that Trump made were false. And then the second stage, he says, is marked by endless repetition of the same lies. And this is based on the idea that if you say something often enough, people are going to believe it, and it's going to take root as the truth. Or a long time, actually, as you're saying, to reverse it. And then in the third stage, he says that contradictions are openly accepted. And back to the 2016 Trump example, when he was on the campaign trail, he made 3 promises. First, he promised that he's going to do massive tax reductions. And then he also promised that he's going to reduce the national debt. And then finally, he promised that he's going to increase spending on military or on defense. Now, these promises are very contradictory to each other. But you know what? People accepted them. People accepted these truths that Trump was putting out there. And then the fourth stage, he says, is where there is, and this is the last stage, is where there is misplaced faith in leaders who pronounce themselves as the voice of the people or the savior of the nation or that other kind of tags that they give themselves. And he says that no such thing exists, no such thing as a savior of the nation exists, no such thing as the voice of the people exists. And when people start believing that these people really represent them in that way, then their freedoms are slowly taken away. So these are the things that he says we should look out for, not just in recognizing a potential tyrannical leader, but in to avoid living in a post-truth world.
You know, DM, there is in chapter 4 of this book, he calls it "Take Responsibility for the Face of the World." And the central thesis of this is he's telling us, be careful, identify potential signs and themes that may destroy humanity. Now, the tagline of this chapter, he says, the symbols of today enable the reality of tomorrow. Notice the swastikas and other signs of hate. Do not look away and do not get used to them. Remove them yourself and set an example for others to do so. Why am I saying this? In the 1930s in the Soviet Union, under the rule of a man called Joseph Stalin, prosperous farmers were portrayed on propaganda posters as pigs. Right? And this was basically to dehumanize them. Now, this dehumanization in rural Russia suggests slaughter. Like kuchinja. All right. Now, the Soviet state sanctioned peasants grabbing land from wealthier landowners, and they were portrayed as pigs. If they were portrayed as pigs, the land was fair game. Okay. Having turned the poor against the rich, the state then seized everyone's land for the new collective farms, and this is where the collectivization as a policy happened.
Yeah.
All right. Now, as a result, millions of people across the Soviet Union died from starvation. It got so bad that some citizens were scavenging on human meat. Now, if you do not see where I'm going with this, this is exactly what we are being told about the hustler nation. It's secluding a socio-economic class from another, and basically saying that the reasons why others are poor is because the reasons why you're poor is because the others are rich. Yeah. Now, if we do not take care, we are going to end up probably what happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. But something he says at the end that I really like to mention. He says, life is political, not because the world cares about how you feel, but because the world reacts to what you do.
Let me add on to that. Let me expound on what you're saying to him.
Yeah.
And what the author tells us is that, not to ignore dangerous language, dangerous acts, and dangerous symbolism, because, as you said, it's a precursor to tyranny.
Oh, yeah.
And he gives an example of the Nazi Party. And when they came to power in Germany, one of their first acts was to call for a boycott of all Jewish businesses.
Yeah.
At first, that call was met with indifference from the population, but then storefronts slowly began to be painted with the words Jewish or Aryan. And before long, this culture of racism gained traction.
Yeah.
And so the language and symbolism a political party uses may initially seem meaningless or even ridiculous, but these simple tools, such as wheelbarrows, can lead to profound consequences.
Absolutely.
The marking of storefronts in Germany wasn't just racism, we're told.
Yeah.
It also exploited people's greed and survival instincts. Once again, we can see this playing out with the hustler nation, what their rallying call is about.
Oh, yes.
Other business owners and hopeful entrepreneurs knew that if a shop was marked Jewish, it would soon be out of business. This meant competition would be reduced and prime commercial real estate would soon be available. All of these things played into the desires of a public that was looking for ways out of their own economic hardships. This is sounding very much like it could be our reality if we don't watch out. So even if the signs of tyranny seem harmless or temporary, it's important to take them seriously and not to allow them to take root and to fester in society. That's what the author is saying. And the blame can't be placed solely on those who painted the storefronts. And what he's telling us here, it's not the people who are beating the drums of war that are solely to be blamed, not the Oscar Sudis of this world and the Johanna Ngenos, but also the ones who remained passive and accepted these actions as a normal change in society. They were also complicit in the murders that soon followed. Therefore, to avoid giving imagery of tyrannical power, we collectively should refuse to display any symbols that represent a party that excludes anybody. And the only way to prevent the regime from continuing to persecute its enemies, or from a movement that is so destructive to mobilize people against one another, is to refuse to play along. And I think that is really the invitation of NSAC at today's meeting, and that will be the theme of even this weekend's pray along weekend and the interdenominational service of Saturday. Absolutely. That will be the theme.
Absolutely.
So on a day where we had a winning headline in Cartoon from the Nation, I want to leave you with a quote from John Locke on tyranny. And he says, "Whenever law ends, tyranny begins." Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are also on your TV screens. Pang, Free to Air, Go TV, and Star Times. Have a good evening.